What's up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. Alright, in today's video, we're going to be talking about X-Men 92, House of 92, number 2. That's a lot of number 2s. By Steve Fox and Salva Espin. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking down how the 10 lives that Jubilee has led are similar, yet in some very key ways, very different from the 10 lives that Moira lived in House of X. How the Quiet Council of Krakoa and the anti-mutant organization Orcs is similar in a lot of ways and different from their original House of X counterparts. And we're finally going to answer the question as to whether or not in a Krakoan era could Wolverine and Sabertooth get along. We're going to talk about all this and more right now, but first, let's hit that intro.
You can't see me, you Stevie, wondering how I reach more evolutions than Evie and make it look easy.
House of 92 does something very similar that House of X number 2 did when it originally came out. For those of you who are unfamiliar with House of X as a whole, it was a story arc that came out a few years ago that basically revolutionized the way we look at the X-Men, giving them a brand new home on the mutant island of Krakoa that used to be a place of death for mutants, and changing their own status quo and turning themselves into a recognized UN nation, conquering death by creating resurrection and also creating the Krakoan gates that allow them to travel anywhere in the universe as long as there's a gate on the other side. And there's a bunch of other things that, came out of that as well, like creating their own mutant language and their own technology and Krakoan medicines. There's all that stuff, but these are kind of the main things about House of X you need to know if you are brand new to this, you haven't been reading X-Men comics in a while, and you see this and you're like, wait a minute, none of this makes sense. This is the only way you'll be able to wrap your head around any of this. That said, what this issue does that House of X number 2 did, it explains how Jubilee came to this particular point. Same as how Moira was retconned and revealed to be a mutant in the original House of X story arc. House of 92 has taken Jubilee and put her in the same role as Moira. The only difference is that we already knew Jubilee was a mutant, so the reveal here is that Jubilee had a secondary mutation, one that allowed her to reset the timeline upon her death, same as how Moira could. Though we could get into all the crazy minutia of how there could potentially be split and alternate timelines, deviant timelines, based on things we have learned from Moira's powers over the course of events since House of X, but that's something I don't think we really have to worry about right now. What we do have to focus on is, okay, well, how does this change anything? How does Jubilee benefit or is disadvantaged by having this ability? Well, the first things first is that she has led the same number of lives that Moira has. At the point of House of X, we discover that Moira has lived 10 separate lives, all of them incredibly different from the life before it. In this one, we know that Jubilee has led precisely 10 lives up to this point, the first of which being one where she never met the X-Men, she never knew that she was a mutant of any kind, she just was living a normal teenager's life. This is very similar to the first life that Moira led in House of X, the biggest difference being that Moira lived to die of old age. She had an entire life, she had a family, children, grandchildren, she had a husband, she literally lived the happiest of lives, and that was pretty much it. There were no mutant or X-Men shenanigans. They kind of almost frame it as though Moira never even knew there was such a thing as mutants or X-Men. Whereas with Jubilee, she doesn't even get that far. She is killed by a Sentinel while she's a teenager. She doesn't even see it coming. Now, her second life is when she's reborn for the first time, obviously, and it's in this life that, based on her previous experiences and the trauma from being killed by a Sentinel, she doesn't really try to understand what her powers are or what she is. She simply just tries to live in hiding. This is actually very different from Moira's second life. Moira's second life, she spent pretty much trying to get some kind of an understanding about what she is, even going out of her way to try and seek out Charles Xavier when he makes the announcement about mutants existing in the world, only she dies, unfortunately, before she gets there. Whereas in this case, Jubilee just stays in hiding and is ultimately found by a Sentinel and killed just the same. She doesn't try to do anything with this new life that she's been given except live in fear. And her third life goes a bit differently than Moira's, in that in Moira's third life, she spent all her time trying to find a cure for being a mutant, and this is ultimately when she would come face to face with Destiny and Mystique and would be burned alive after being told about how her powers work. Jubilee doesn't get such a harrowing encounter because, well, for one, Jubilee's not a scientist, and I'm not saying that she's not smart, but she's not a genius level intellect by anyone's stretch of the imagination. She isn't intelligent enough to come up with, some kind of a mutant cure, so she wouldn't track on Destiny's radar at all, at least not in that regard. In her third life, she just seeks out the X-Men. She finds them and she lives out a life that is, if you are familiar with the X-Men comics of the 90s and the Jim Lee era of X-Men, you would see things that would pretty much let you know that, yeah, she lived out the Jubilee life that we all know from the early 90s. And then, of course, ultimately Sentinels will come and they will destroy everything and her just as well. It's not until Jubilee's fourth life where she does what is ultimately kind of a blend of Moira's fourth and fifth lives, where she basically seeks out the X-Men at a very early age, just the same as how Moira would do. She tried to learn everything it is that she could possibly learn about mutants in her fourth and fifth lives, in the fourth one being the life that kind of mirrors a lot of what we know of the X-Men's earliest days, including everything from the 5-piece original recipe X-Men leading all the way up to AVX. Now, Jubilee's fifth life, this is basically kind of a nod towards the crazy time during, I believe it was X-Men Volume 3, number 1 through 6, where Jubilee was turned into a vampire by Dracula's son, Xeris. There's really not much else that's said here except that we see Dracula clearly in the background, so maybe there is a little bit of a shift in who was the one who actually turned her, but ultimately, yeah, that was a thing. We don't really know what happens to her in this life. She probably gets staked by Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Blade, who knows. In Jubilee's sixth life, this one is almost word for word, shot for shot Moira's sixth life, where Moira had become a military-trained assassin and tracked down every single person in Bolivar Trask's ancestry and leading all the way up to Bolivar himself and killed every last single one of them, because the Trask are synonymous with Sentinels. So obviously, if you want to get rid of Sentinels, then you go after the person who creates them. You don't just go after the Sentinels, you don't just go after Master Mold, you take out the guy who makes them. This is what Jubilee did. She goes on about roughly the same type of killing spree, being depicted with a sniper rifle. Now, whether or not she gets killed by a Sentinel in a wild Master Mold facility, that we don't know. Her fate is largely unknown, but if Moira's sixth life isn't anything to go by, that's probably what happened. And then in Jubilee's seventh life, this life pretty much mirrors Moira's seventh and eighth lives, with her having thrown in her lot with villains. In Moira's seventh and eighth life, she threw in her lot with Magneto as well as Apocalypse. Only with Jubilee, instead of throwing in her lot with, I don't know, like Apocalypse or Magneto, she picks a very odd duck in the form of Cable's clone, Strife, and presumably is destroyed by a gang of Nimrods. And then we see an eighth life of Jubilees that doesn't really seem to have any rhyme or reason to it, though it does seem like she's wearing the classic yellow and blue getup from the Jim Lee 90s era, so there's no telling what's really going on there. And then her ninth life is very similar to Moira's, yet incredibly different at the same time. This time around, where we know in Moira's ninth life, she lived all the way up to the year 1000, where she was even being held inside of a preserve by the post-humans, who were basically awaiting to be consumed by the Phalanx. In this particular instance, however, she is not, trapped in some preserve. She's living in what appears to be a Days of Future Past style timeline, and she's created what is Generation X. It's basically all the mutants in the far-flung future. And ultimately, it's here that she learns the true nature of her abilities, whereas with Moira, she learned those things pretty early on in her third life. Jubilee was not so lucky. It's not until Jubilee's ninth life that she learns her power to reset the timeline upon her death is finite. It can only happen a number of times. Very similar to Moira. Moira was only fated to live 10 lives and an 11th one if she makes the right choices. Nimrod doesn't give her such information. Nimrod assesses based on his ability to analyze mutant powers and abilities that she can only die one more time and reset the timeline, and just kills her right then and there, seemingly thinking that whatever it is that she could potentially do, she wouldn't be able to accomplish even if she had only one more life. Now with Jubilee being reset to her 10th life, this is where basically she winds up in this era of the X-Men 90s animated series timeline, and everything else kind of moves on from there. The real question is she going to be set up the same way that Moira has been set up in House of X, where it was revealed that she could potentially live an 11th life if she made the right choices? And we know if you fast forward to now, Moira did in fact get her 11th life. However, it was kind of in a weird way. It didn't reset the timeline, her being reborn for an 11th life. It all culminated in Inferno when Mystique and Destiny had used Forge's mutant power nullifier on Moira so that they could kill her without resetting the timeline. And Moira hasn't been a mutant since then, and we do know that she was killed by Omega Wolverine, the same Wolverine who was in the Preserve with her in year 1000 and was consumed by the Phalanx himself. And we know that in the far-flung future, Moira has thrown in her lot with the Phalanx in that reality. So it stands to reason, even though, yeah, a lot of the stuff that is happening with Jubilee, while it mirrors a lot of the stuff from House of X and the current crop of X-Men comics, only in, a 90s setting, is any of this going to translate over that? I don't really think that's going to be the case. I think this story is going in its own direction, which is perfectly fine because otherwise it would get boring. And we would already know what's gonna happen. Now, do I think that Jubilee will take on a more, I don't know, villainous role later down the line of this, comic, depending on how long this is going to go? Yeah, sure, maybe, possibly. I feel like they have to do something with Jubilee because honestly in House of X, we didn't really get a whole lot of Moira. We saw her very sparingly even after that. So yeah, you kind of got to do something. But how this is going to play out, as far as long-term booking goes, hard to say. However, I do like what this is setting up. I mean, I like the entire makeup of this comic as far as how they're taking things that are very similar to what we've seen since House of X and putting them in this comic, but putting a little twist on it, like in the case of the Marauders. The Marauders are a thing in this comic, only they're not led by Kate Pryde. They're led by Rogue, where she's accompanied by pretty much, and I don't mean this in a negative way, literally the gayest team of X-Men you could possibly put together. With Gambit feeling jealous that she's running off with Northstar and Iceman, Richter and Shatterstar, so on and so forth, and it's pretty much all of the homosexual X-Men in one spot. Even with Rogue making a tongue-in-cheek remark about why Lorna, aka Polaris, and Iceman didn't work out. We also see nods to the fact that Sinister, while working with Beast on scientific matters of a Krakoan nature, that he's already laying the foundation for the creation of chimeras, though he's doing it when Beast isn't looking. And while the Krakoan era is led by the Quiet Council, here it's not exactly called the Quiet Council. It's referred to as the Inner Circle, very similar to something you would see in the Hellfire Club, whereas while we still have characters like Xavier, Magneto, Apocalypse, Jean, Storm, Mystique, Sinister, Emma Frost, all those characters seem to be largely present and accounted for on the Quiet Council. We do see some new faces that we normally wouldn't see on the Quiet Council. Case in point, one of those characters being Cyclops, a guy who didn't even want to be on the Quiet Council. He was basically relegated to being a captain, which is basically like the leader of the military forces of Krakoa. We also see characters like Omega Red, with a 12th member that I couldn't really tell who it was. Part of me wonders if it was Namor, but who knows? We'll have to wait and see. They're never showcased or get any actual panel time, and we only really see them from like upper over-the-shoulder angle. We also see a very different Orcus. This is an Orcus that is led by pretty much one of the more deadly combinations of rogues galleries that I think we've seen in recent X-Men memory. Only more recently have Orcus started to bring in more bombastic-looking figures like, characters like MODOK or Dr. Stasis and, Fei Long, so on and so forth. Even Abigail Brand, a mutant herself, being on the council, and we know that Moira, the current version of Moira McTaggart, is also working with Orcus. In this particular instance, it's going to be characters like Henry Peter Gyrick, Graydon Creed, the son of Sabertooth, and we also see Donald Pierce, we see Cameron Hodge, we also see a Sentinel version of Trask, as he was killed in the first issue and his consciousness was uploaded to a Sentinel, which oddly enough is in a relationship seemingly with Lady Deathstrike, who is also on the board of Orcs. And I'm gonna go on a limb and call it now that Trask and Deathstrike are meant to fill the void, or rather the space, that characters like Nimrod and Omega Sentinel fill on Orcs currently, only they may put a slightly different spin on this. And we also see another character I didn't expect to see, which is G.W. Bridge, George Washington Bridge, a character who, if you're familiar with the old 80s and 90s era of X-Force, you'd be very familiar with. He's a very unlikely character, though I do find it very interesting that Orcus in this is a lot more effective in their full frontal assaults. In the main timeline, Orcus doesn't really try to directly hit the mutants. They're kind of building to something far bigger. And in this instance, this version of Orcus is sending direct conflict at Krakoa in the form of a TriSentinel. TriSentinel's already being pretty OP as it is. They have regenerative abilities that allow them to, even if you melted them down to like sludge or even dust or whatever, you could burn them to cinders and they would be able to regenerate to a fully formed TriSentinel. They're huge, far bigger than your average Sentinel, and have powers that completely dwarf the average Sentinel. And while the X-Men and the entire island as a whole really are able to take down this TriSentinel, it has one of the most deadly abilities of any Sentinel, I think, up to this point. And you're probably sitting there thinking, oh, what kind of laser cannon is this thing gonna shoot at them? What kind of, special beam cannon does this thing have? Does it have final explosion? No, it's actually something more cerebral. This TriSentinel wasn't meant to kill all the mutants on Krakoa. I mean, yeah, sure, if it killed some, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. However, what this thing was actually sent there to do was to collect data. This TriSentinel was absorbing all of the data that the X-Men were giving it. What mutants could do what mutants could synergize with other mutants, and what tactics the mutants can use to take down a TriSentinel so that they can make an even better one that they would not be able to take down. And very likely this is the precursor to Nimrod, which could do the exact same thing. Observe and analyze a mutant's abilities and figure out the best tactics to overcome them, and in a lot of cases adapt to those mutants and become, for all intents and purposes, invulnerable to those mutants. The last thing I wanted to bring up, this is just more of a funny aside, is what's going on with Wolverine in this comic. The main thing with Wolverine in this comic that I think a lot of people are probably going to be thrown off by is the fact that in this era, Sabertooth isn't in the pit. He is walking around, just, acting like his normal Sabertooth self. And this time around, we get to answer a question I think a lot of people were pondering when House of X came out. If all the X-Men villains and heroes had to come together and live in one place, how well would some of them get along? And one of the ones we never got to figure out was, would Wolverine and Sabertooth be able to get along? We know that Wolverine and Omega Red were not able to get along in any capacity, at least not yet. But we didn't really know whether or not Sabertooth and Wolverine would be able to, squash it. Would they be able to come together as friends and, let bygones be bygones? And we get an answer. No. Wolverine doesn't trust Sabertooth, same as he felt about Omega Red. If he didn't trust Omega Red, just imagine that he would never trust Sabertooth. Sabertooth has done far more harm to Wolverine and has messed up Wolverine's life way more than Omega Red ever could. When it comes to people terrorizing Wolverine, Omega Red is like the Diet Coke of terrorizing someone's life. Sabertooth is that OG original with the sugarcane Coke, like the stuff that they don't even make anymore. So of course, he doesn't trust him, but the thing is, Sabertooth is being his usual normal cunning self, and while Wolverine is pretty close to figuring out that Jubilee is not dead, as everyone wants to believe that she is because she was supposedly killed by a Sentinel, Wolverine is pretty close to figuring out that Jubilee is actually alive and on the island, and Sabertooth is literally right there, getting ready to figure this out with him. Once again, this was not a comic that I was really just absolutely clamoring for, but I do like what they're doing with this. They're taking a scenario, a very popular scenario as of late, and blending it with probably one of the most iconic X-Men anythings ever created. Just you're taking the 90s era X-Men, not just the Jim Lee era of X-Men, but also the X-Men animated series, ostensibly probably the most popular form of X-Men media ever made, and you're marrying it together in a way that just works. It's like chocolate and peanut butter coming together for the first time. There's some other cool stuff in here too. There's some really interesting little Easter eggs and nods. We even get kind of a nod that Wolverine and Jean Grey aren't together in this scenario as they are in the House of X, like the main House of X storyline, whereas Wolverine, Cyclops, and Jean are in a polyamorous relationship. Here it kind of seems like Jean isn't as interested in Wolverine, at a point where we see that when Cyclops asks where Jean was, she says, oh, nothing important. Though, in a way, one could take this as her curving Wolverine, but you could also say maybe in this era she is maintaining her relationship with Logan in some way, shape, form, or fashion, but maybe she isn't, being open about it with Scott. Maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe the whole polyamory angle is just left out of it. But yeah, there's lots of other cool stuff. We get to see some really interesting things, and I like what Steve Fox and Sal Espin are doing here. It looks great. It looks fun. It actually makes me, when I read this comic, I instantaneously start, humming the X-Men theme in the back of my head, and start, reaching for my, mouse to click on, Disney Plus or something and start watching, the X-Men animated series while I'm reading this. This is that good. But anyways, that's everything I want to talk about with X-Men 92, House of 92, number 2. My God, it's a lot of twos. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more awesome videos like it, make sure you hit that subscribe button. I post multiple videos throughout the week just like this one. And also, if you are someone who is not familiar with House of X and you want to learn more about it, check out my video series over here where I'm breaking down literally every facet of House of X and everything that's come out since then. But in the meantime, let me know what you thought about X-Men 92, House of 92, number 2. Keep it plus ultra and sound off in the comments.